Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. And in today's video, we're going to be going over a little bit of a simplified version of the flow of the heart. So this is a very simplified version. This is not going to be too complicated, but we're going to just get some general understanding behind the flow of the heart. So when we go into the flow of the heart, we need to understand some basic anatomy that goes behind this so we can get a better understanding of it. So in regards to the flow of the heart or the anatomy of the heart is divided up into four main chambers. We have two atria, which kind of represent the upper chambers of the heart, and we have two ventricles, which kind of represent the lower chambers of the heart. Now, the atria kind of receive blood from both the vena cava and from the lungs, right? So the right atria actually receives deoxygenated blood from the vena cavas, and the left atrium receives oxygenated blood. So that's kind of the difference between the two. The right is deoxygenated blood, and the left is going to be oxygenated blood. And we're going to go into that in a little more detail in this video. Now, by going past the atria, now we go into the ventricles. Now, the ventricles are going to be there to pump blood to the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic valve. So the right ventricle receives blood from the right atria, and it's going to be pumping that blood, as we can see. So if you follow my cursor, we have the right atria here. It's going to be letting the blood flow into the right ventricle here, and that's going to be pumping the blood into the pulmonary trunk here through the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then with the left ventricle, right, we're going to be receiving blood into the left atria. That blood is now going to flow into the left ventricle. And that blood is actually go right in here through what we call the aortic valve, right? That valve is going to open up and it's going to allow blood to flow into the aortic trunk. And then it's going to go into the rest of the body. That's what we call the systemic circuit. Now, when we refer back to the right atria, we were wondering how we got blood and how it was deoxygenated. So over here, if you follow the cursor, we have the superior vena cava. So now the superior vena cava is actually going to be receiving blood, deoxygenated blood, from most of the upper extremities. So this is like, if you think about the thorax, the upper body, like the head, neck, and shoulders, and all those kind of anatomical parts, that blood is going to be recycled after it's been used. It's going to come back through all those veins in the brachiocephalic veins in the entire upper body, and it's going to be shuffled into the superior vena cava, and that's going to go right into the right atria, where it's going to begin its cycling to go back into the lungs and then back into through the heart and all that to be oxygenated again. Now we have the inferior vena cava. It does a very similar job. Inferior vena cava is going to be there to receive deoxygenated blood from the lower limbs and through, like, let's say the external iliac artery, right? And the external iliac vein, I apologize there. And it's going to be bringing that blood back into the inferior vena cava to then be processed by the heart and lungs to be oxygenated again. Now, some might be wondering, how does this occur with regards to the lower body? Because when you think of gravity, gravity is always going down. A lot of this comes back to venous return, right? So venous return is another way of thinking about muscle contraction and how that muscle, when it contracts, blood is going to be pumped up through the muscle. So when you go walk and you contract your lower extremities, venous return occurs, so that blood is pumped back up through the veins to travel back up to the heart. So in this case, that blood is going back up into the inferior vena cava, and that's going to go right into this right atria, and it's going to be cycled back around so we can get it oxygenated again. Going into the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae. So this might be a poor example, but this is one I can just think of right off the top of my head. If you think about, let's say you're doing an exercise in the gym and you think about your bicep and your arm with your hand. Now your hand is kind of like the chordae tendineae, and your bicep is kind of like the papillary muscles. When these close and it uses the bicep to flex the arm, the chordae tendineae kind of opens up what we call the tricuspid valve, as we can see here, right? We kind of open up these valves through the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles to allow this blood to flow into the ventricles. Now, what this does is actually helps to regulate the amount of blood that flows into the ventricles from the atria, because we don't want backflow because that's going to cause problems with our that might cause arrhythmias, and that might just cause that's going to cause problems with regards to the blood flow and how the circulation occurs. So we have the chordae tendineae, which are kind of like cord-like structures that attach to the valves and the papillary muscles. And when the papillary muscles contract, they kind of pull on the chordae tendineae and allow blood to flow into the ventricles to be pumped through the heart and to be oxygenated and go into the rest of the body. Now we have the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. So as you see at the top here, this is kind of like a transverse view from superior to inferior. And then this one is kind of like a kind of gives us like an open view from the front so we can see it in a better way. It's kind of like this more coronal frontal view. So it divides the body in front and back, right? So as we can see, the tricuspid valve, this is what we call as the right atrioventricular valve. This has three cusps, or like three leaflets. You may see it in a couple of different ways. This is typically located between the right atria and the right ventricle. So very similar to the last picture, we had the tricuspid valve here, right atria, right ventricle, and that's where the tricuspid valve is. The bicuspid valve is kind of like the two leaflets, or the two cusps, and that's located between the left atria and the left ventricle. So like I said before, we have these valves, and these will work with the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles to kind of regulate how much blood is rushed in or flows into the ventricles so that we can regulate the blood flow through the heart. Now we have the right and we have the left ventricle. The right ventricle, after it receives blood from the right atria, it's going to then pump that blood into, when the pressure gets high in the ventricle, it's then going to pump that blood into the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary semilunar valve. Now, when that valve opens, it's going to allow that right ventricle to pump the blood up there, and that pulmonary trunk is actually going to distribute that blood to the lungs, to the pulmonary arteries. The left ventricle, after it receives blood from the left atria and the bicuspid valves are open, when the blood gets filled into the left ventricle and the pressure becomes high, the left atria with the bicuspid valves are going to get closed, and the aortic semilunar valves are going to open. So that blood's going to be pumped from the left ventricle up the aorta through the aortic arch into the rest of the body. This can go down the aortic arch, down to the rest of the body. So the right, if you think right ventricle, pulmonary trunk, lungs, left atria, left ventricle, aortic arch, rest of the body. Now we have the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins. Now these kind of act as like a connection or like a cross bridge between the lungs and the heart. So the pulmonary veins are there to help bring oxygenated blood back from the lungs to the left atria. So after we go from the right atria, the right ventricle, that blood is going to be pumped into the pulmonary trunk, and then it's going to be distributed through the pulmonary arteries. So the arteries here are highlighted in blue. You may see that the arteries and veins have different colors on different models, but from what you can take away from this video is that arteries push blood or pump blood away, and pulmonary veins, or just veins in general, bring blood towards the heart. So the pulmonary veins are going to go from the pulmonary trunk out to the lungs. That's where the blood is going to be oxygenated through the capillary exchange in the lungs. And then the pulmonary veins are going to be there to transport the blood from the lungs into the left atria. And then we're going to go on from here. So to kind of wrap this up, this is a very simplified kind of version of the flow of the heart. But as you can see, I think this is a decent diagram shown here. Excuse me. We have right over here, if you follow the cursor, that is the right atria. That's going to be receiving blood from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And it's going to collect right here into the right atria. Once that pressure becomes high, it's then going to open up the tricuspid valve or the atrioventricular valve, right, by the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae. That's going to allow the blood to flow into this right ventricle. Once the pressure in the right ventricle gets high, the atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve here is going to close, and the pulmonary semilunar valve is then going to open. That's going to allow blood to go from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk and then into the pulmonary arteries, where it's then going to be oxygenated by the lungs through the CO2-O2 exchange. After that occurs, we're then going to get the blood to flow back from the pulmonary arteries into the pulmonary veins into the left atria over here. Now, the left atria, that's going to, once the pressure gets high there, the bicuspid valve, or those two cusps or leaflets, whatever you want to call them, are then going to go into, they're going to open up through the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles. That blood is then going to flow into the left ventricle. Once the pressure gets high there, that's the bicuspid valves are going to start to close up, and then we're going to have the aortic semilunar valves. Those are going to open to then allow the blood to be transported from the left ventricle into the aortic arch and then out to the rest of the body. Now, if you want to know a little cool fact, the left ventricle is primarily one of the most important aspects of the heart because it is there to help maintain regular blood pressure. So that's just a cool little fact. If you ever want to think, if you just want to take something cool away from this video. And yeah, so the left ventricle, when it goes up to the aortic arch and back, that kind of pumps blood to the rest of the body. So when you think right ventricle, right, that's pumping blood to the lungs, that's what's going to help with that capillary exchange, right? And that's going to allow for the oxygenation of blood. Once that goes into the left ventricle is then going to pump the blood into the aortic arch, and it's going to send it everywhere. That's what we call the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit is with the pulmonary trunk into the lungs. So just to kind of give a little idea behind systole and diastole. So diastole is when the atrioventricular valves open and the semilunar valves close. So if you think about it, it's when the ventricle or the atrias kind of fill up, and that's when those kind of bicuspid and tricuspid valves open so that blood can be flowed into the ventricles. Once the blood flows into the ventricles, they allow the pressure to get the body senses, or we have fibers in there, or like kind of sensory fibers inside the heart that kind of monitor this pressure change. Once the blood leaves from the atria and they go into the ventricles and the pressure becomes higher, those bi and tricuspid valves start to close, and the aortic and the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve both open so that blood can be pumped from the ventricles into the lungs and to the rest of the body, so that we have this continuous cycle of this oxygenation. With the systole, the ventricular pressure is increased, the semilunar valves are open, and the atrioventricular valves close to prevent the backflow into the atria. So we want this constant, like, kind of figure eight pattern out of the heart so that we're able to pump blood efficiently, and so we're able to use it when we're performing day-to-day activities. So if you guys have any questions, drop them in the comment section below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I did making it. And yeah, hope you guys have a great day, and thanks for watching, and here's to getting strong.